My name is Olivia Fryman, and I am the Curator of Collections for English Heritage with responsibility for Down House. Down House is the home of Charles Darwin, where he lived for 40 years and where he developed his groundbreaking theory of evolution. Today is a very special day for Down House because it's the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin's follow-up book to The Origin of Species, in which he applied his theory of evolution to mankind. So today I'm going to be talking to Jeremy DeSilva, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth College, who has recently published a new book on the descent with Princeton University Press. The book is called A Most Interesting Problem: What Charles Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. Now, Jeremy came to Down House in the spring of 2019 as part of his research for the book, so I'm very excited to hear what he and his co-authors concluded in their assessment of the descent of man. So Jeremy, perhaps just to kick off, you could start by telling me what you think the significance of Darwin's descent is, and whether you think it's as important as his more celebrated book, The Origin of Species.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, The Origin of Species is what made Darwin famous and continues to for good reason, in that he was able to articulate and spell out the evidence for a mechanism for evolutionary change. People had been thinking about evolution and the changeability of species for a long time, but it was Darwin who provided the mechanism of natural selection for evolution. But in Origin of Species, he said very little about humans. And it wasn't until he wrote Descent of Man that he applied not only natural selection, but a new idea that he pitched in Descent of Man, and that's sexual selection, and applied these ideas to humans. And so the lasting impact, one of the lasting impacts, I think, of Descent of Man and the application of Darwin's ideas to humans is that we are related to every living organism on Earth. That the processes that led to the evolution of life, they weren't separate for us. They applied to us too. And that there's, he called this, a grandeur in this view of life, that all living organisms are actually related. And it turns out, of course, with humans, that we're more closely related to primates, and in particular to apes, and even more specifically to the African great apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees. And Darwin was able to lay out the evidence for that with using very little information at that time. 150 years later, we have genetic evidence, fossil evidence, but he was able to support these views in an impressive way 150 years ago. But there's also a lasting legacy of Darwin's Descent of Man, in that some of the words that he used and some of the mistakes he made in describing sex differences between men and women, and also discussing the different, what he calls the different races of man, and that these ideas that he promoted in the book are now known to be incorrect. And yet they still are used by people, and misused by people who have white nationalist agendas. And so there is a damaging legacy as well that we have to confront when we think about Darwin's impact on the world 150 years after he wrote.
So in a way, although Darwin was a very liberal man, a scientist, he was still a Victorian gentleman who couldn't really escape some of the prejudices of his time. That's really interesting.
That's right, and it's what fascinates me most about this is that he was an out of the box thinker. He was able to think differently about the natural world, about our place in it. He was able to think differently than other thinkers at the time, and to write these incredibly impactful books. But he couldn't think differently about sort of his own white male privilege. And it really shows you the power of bias, is it?
Oh yeah, so although it's an incredibly important book, there are still some things that even Darwin didn't quite get right.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And look, as a scientist, there are things that I'm not getting right. There are
Hmm.
things that, all the great scientists and the great thinkers, we get things wrong too, that's okay, as long as your contemporaries and future generations challenge your ideas and search for evidence and say, wait a minute here, are we sure we're right about this? And again, in 150 years after Descent of Man, we can reflect back on Darwin and see that certain things he was remarkably right about, and certain things he was wrong about. And that's how science works.
Yeah. So related to that, if you could have a conversation with Charles Darwin now and you could tell him about a scientific discovery in the last 150 years, what would you choose, and what kind of reaction
Mm.
do you think he would give?
So I am a paleoanthropologist. I study fossils, and to me, fossils reveal to us the path by which we became human. They show us the physical evidence for our ancestry. And at the time of Darwin's writing Descent of Man, we had very few fossils, and most of them were what we now recognize as Neanderthals. And in fact, Darwin in 1864 held this Neanderthal skull in his hands, uh, but didn't recognize it as a Neanderthal. He wasn't really sure. He assumed, well, we actually don't really know what he thought of it, because he only wrote a single line in a letter about what he called the wonderful Gibraltar skull. We now know today this is from a 50,000-year-old Neanderthal. So I would want to show him fossils and show him how the fossil record has revealed this absolutely magnificent story of how we became human. And the one I would show him is Lucy. Lucy was discovered in 1974, so she's coming up on her 50th anniversary of being known to the scientific community. And Lucy is such a beautiful example of a hominin, an ancient ancestor of humans that could move on two legs like we can, but it had a small brain. She had a small brain. And so Darwin recognized that humans are different from the other apes in a certain, a number of characteristics: that we move on two legs, that we have tiny little canine teeth compared to their big fang teeth, that we have large brains, and that we're technologically savvy, that we use stone tools. And he saw these four features evolving in parallel, evolving as a suite. That as we moved on two legs, we freed the hands for use of tools. With tools, we didn't need those big canines anymore, and we could extract more resources from our environment and evolve large brains. So he saw them all evolving in concert. They didn't. We now know that upright walking happened long before tool use, happened long before brain enlargement. And Lucy shows us that. So I would want to show him fossils that demonstrate he was right that humans had an ancestry. He was right that humans are related to the African apes, but the order in which things happen was different from how he predicted. And how was he to know? He laid out a hypothesis, and we now know with the evidence we have that things were actually a little bit different than how he envisioned it unfolding. And I think he'd be thrilled by that. Knowing what I know about Darwin, he was always interested in new evidence and new information that might change his mind. And you see that as he writes, the second edition of Descent of Man, or multiple editions of Origin of Species, where he tweaks things and changes his mind in places when his colleagues have convinced him to do so.
Absolutely. I can imagine him rushing back to the study at Down to do more research. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Jeremy, it's really fascinating and really, really great to talk to you on this very special day for Darwin. Many, many congratulations on the publication of your book, and I'm sure it's going to make a really big difference to everybody's appreciation of the descent and its place within scientific history.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. I so appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and all you do to keep Darwin's legacy carrying on.